This is a story of two tribes, one which belonged where it was, and another which did not. In other words, a native tribe and an invading tribe. The natives were confident. The natives knew it would be but a matter of time before the gods would deal with the invaders, because the invading tribesmen were far from their own hunting grounds. They foraged awkwardly. As long as the sun smiled and the land was warm, they might get by, but when the terrible cold descended upon them, they would be lost. And it happened just as the native defending tribesmen had predicted. In the lore of the invaders, it would long be remembered as the starving time. As it began, the invaders relied on their food gatherers, but the food gatherers had to go so far, they had to travel such great distances, their supplies were mostly spoiled by the time they got back, and the cold wind swept across the swamp, and the invaders were sore afraid. Repeatedly, their hunters set out in search of game, returned empty-handed. So far from their own tribal territory, they scarcely knew what they were looking for. Nothing that appeared edible was growing. Moment by moment, the invaders' choice grew clearer. They would have to break their own tribal traditions or starve. So they began to break their own tribal traditions. The first to be eaten were the horses, and then the dogs, then the cats, and eventually the rats and mice. The meager rations were guarded carefully. Tribesmen caught stealing were punished by death. While the hunters scoured the wilds for anything edible, snakes or roots, anything to feed upon, native tribesmen, the natives, seized the opportunity to exterminate the invading enemies, and too weak to resist, the intruders died by the dozen. As the starving time continued, leather became almost palatable, and at last the inevitable, the shattering of the ultimate tribal taboo, cannibalism. The invaders managed to kill one of the natives, and they ate him. In fact, one of the starving invaders even killed his own wife and salted her down and devoured her. And yet even in that most terrible time, there were certain tribal laws which could not be broken. The man who ate his wife was himself put to death. 9 of 10 invading tribesmen did not survive that winter. 9 of 10 did not survive. The natives took some satisfaction in that. What you've seen through their eyes. To them, the men who had invaded their shores were simply members of a curious, distant tribe. Now, in the centuries since, we Americans have much romanticized our own roots on this continent. Maybe there's nothing very wrong with the repeatedly invoked image of a turkey and pumpkin pie feast that never was. But the true thanks in our Thanksgivings ought to be that no matter how hard things get for us now, they'll never again be as hard as they once were, when men resorted to eating their enemies and eventually their own wives in 1610 in Jamestown. Now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. On December the 6th, 1606, 3 English ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, which were commanded by Christopher Newport, left England with 104 men and boys. On May 13, 1607, after 5 months and 7 days at sea, they arrived in North America. After careful consideration of the criteria of the Virginia Company, the company that funded the settlement, criteria which included being far from land and surrounded by water on 3 sides to make it more easily defendable, surrounded by water deep enough so the English could tie their ships at the shoreline, and the site had to be uninhabited by native tribes, the colonists established the first permanent English settlement in North America. They named it Jamestown after King James I. that being the same King James who commissioned and sponsored the King James Version of the Bible. The settlers immediately set to work building a walled fort for protection, houses, and other buildings. By June 15th, they had completed the fort. Although that land appeared to be uninhabited, they had settled on the Powhatan Indians' hunting land. On June 22nd, a week after the fort was completed, Captain Newport left for England to get more supplies. Now remember, a trip to England and back could take almost a year. Within days of Captain Newport leaving, the settlers ran into trouble. They began to get sick. The colonists suffered from swellings, fluxes, and fevers. Their stores of food began running low. Chief Powhatan sent gifts of food to help the early settlers. In January 1608, Captain Newport returned with more supplies and 100 more settlers. He was shocked to learn that of the 104 original settlers, only 38 remained. With the help of the newcomers, the settlers expanded the fort and reinforced the shelters. Men armed with muskets stood guard. In April 1608, Captain Newport returned to England again for more supplies. He returned in October with supplies and settlers, including 2 women, the first female English settlers in North America, and John Smith. Now, John Smith befriended other tribes and eventually convinced Powhatan to stop the attacks. At one time, according to John Smith, Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, saved him from being killed by the tribe. Powhatan resumed sending food to the settlers. Then 2 events changed the whole situation. In August 1609, John Smith was injured in a gunpowder incident and had to return to England for medical treatment. Then, a clumsy settler accidentally started a fire which destroyed their living quarters. The settlers needed more food than the natives would or could provide. You see, Jamestown and the surrounding area was in the middle of a 7-year drought. Relations between the settlers and the natives quickly broke down. By late 1609, relations between the settlers and the natives had worsened to the point that the settlers were afraid to venture outside the protection of the fort. Those who did were subject to capture, torture, and ultimately death. John Ratcliffe tried to build a trade relationship with Powhatan as John Smith had, but Ratcliffe was captured and tortured to death. The settlers had little chance of survival unless they could get more supplies from England. On June 2, 1609, Captain Newport commanded a 9-vessel supply fleet bound for Jamestown. Most of the food supplies were transported on the Sea Venture, the ship commanded by Newport. While in the Atlantic Ocean, the fleet encountered a severe storm which lasted for 3 days and nights. The Sea Venture was separated from the other 8 ships. 7 of those ships made it to Jamestown with 200 to 300 men, but with only minimal supplies. The other ship returned to England. On July 28th, the damaged Sea Venture was deliberately driven onto the reefs of Bermuda to keep it from sinking, and the 150 passengers and crew made it ashore. The additional settlers to Jamestown exacerbated their problem. There were hundreds more mouths to feed, but not enough food. There was no way for the settlers to prepare for winter. They were afraid to venture outside the fort and had little food stored up. The winter of 1609-1610 was known as the starving time, as Mr. Harvey explained. In May of 2013, archaeologists revealed that they found physical evidence of cannibalism from the starving time. The archaeologists uncovered the remains of a girl who died at the age of about 14 years old. By using her skull and jawbone, they were able to recreate what she probably looked like. They nicknamed her Jane. Prior to finding Jane, historians had no physical evidence of cannibalism other than the writings of survivors. Some historians argued that the writings were just a ploy by the settlers to receive additional resources from England. Bill Kelso, chief archaeologist of the Jamestown Rediscovery Project, explained that there were marks on the skeleton, including the skull, which were made by different tools such as knives and cleavers. Kelso said there are hundreds of cut marks, sawing marks along the jawbone. Some of them suggest the removal of soft tissue in the brain. The cuts were made similar to the way that people butchered animals. Now, back in Bermuda in the fall of 1609, the passengers and crew of the Sea Venture began salvaging building materials from the ship and began building two smaller vessels they named Deliverance and the aptly named Patience. After 9 months, the boats were completed, loaded, and all but 2 men sailed for Jamestown. Those 2 men who remained did so to claim Bermuda for England. On May 23, 1610, the survivors from the Sea Venture, including John Rolfe, arrived at Jamestown, but they were shocked at what they found. The settlement was in shambles. The palisades of the fort were torn down. Gates were off their hinges. Houses had been dismantled and burned for firewood. And there was virtually no food. Of the 500 settlers, only 60 remained, and many of those were sick or dying. Even with fresh supplies, the settlers decided to abandon Jamestown. On June the 7th, the settlers boarded the Deliverance and Patience and began the return trip to England. Now remember John Smith, who'd returned to England for medical treatment following the gunpowder accident? While convalescing, he wrote a book about his experiences in Jamestown. His book renewed interest in Jamestown, and investments in the Virginia Company soared. On April 1st, 1610, while the survivors on Bermuda were still building those 2 smaller ships, 3 large ships full of supplies, additional colonists, a doctor, and most importantly, an abundance of food left England for Jamestown. They were led by the new governor, Thomas West, Baron de la Ware. We now know him as Lord Delaware. The settlers who were abandoning Jamestown met the 3 ships after they had only gone about 10 miles down the James River. Lord Delaware forced the abandoning party to return to Jamestown against their will. But Lord Delaware not only turned the colonists around, he turned the colony around. John Rolfe, one of the men from the Sea Venture, had brought a new strain of tobacco seeds to the colony. Within 2 years, with Lord Delaware's leadership and John Rolfe's farming techniques, the colony was thriving. And with the exportation of tobacco, the colony became profitable. Now just imagine if those ships of settlers who were abandoning Jamestown had left just a day or 2 earlier. Had Lord Delaware's ships left England a day or 2 later? Had they encountered a storm in the Atlantic? Had any one of many scenarios happened in which those ships of abandoning settlers had not met up with the resupply ships led by Lord Delaware, the history of our country would be vastly, vastly different. If England had abandoned Jamestown in 1610, there would be no United States. There would have been no American Revolution. There would have been no colonies to join together against the mother country. So as we sit down to Thanksgiving dinner this year, take just a moment to remember the unimaginable hardships those early settlers experienced in Jamestown. Think how hard it must have been for those settlers who had their minds set on returning to the safety of England. Think how hard it must have been for them to return to Jamestown. We have so much to be thankful for, don't you think? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.